Well, for some analysis, we can bring in Helen Yaffe, a professor of Latin American political economy at the University of Glasgow. She joins us from Glasgow via video. Good morning, and thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us.
Good morning. Thank you for inviting me.
We heard the exasperation of one Havana resident in that report, but he also said it's been like this for 60 years. Just how unprecedented is the crisis facing Cuba?
Well, I mean, the Cubans have put up with a blockade from the United States basically since 1962 officially, but economic warfare began much earlier than that. And they have had a period of crisis, which is comparable to this, which was obviously after the collapse of the Soviet bloc, when Cuba lost 87% of its trade and investment. And at that point, Cuba was far more dependent on oil imports, mainly from the Soviet Union, mainly from Russia. And those dropped by 90% oil imports. So Cuba's, I mean, the young man interviewed was probably not alive at that time, but Cubans have lived through a similar fuel crisis. But this scenario is quite unprecedented in the sense that, you know, as your report reflected, this is an oil embargo imposed since the end of January, and with the threat of a, military intervention as well, when Trump says that he'll take Cuba one way or another. So it's a very serious situation. In one way, it's not as dire as it was in the 1990s, and that is because Cuba has been made some successes with a transition to renewable energies. So at the moment, during the daytime, they can produce almost, well, between, let's say, a third and half of their energy needs can be met through solar panels, but they lack the capacity for storage. So that means, at nighttime, the blackout is more severe. And they also lack the fuel for their transport fleet. And the impact of that is really serious because even with the donations that you showed that the global convoy has brought in, the question is, how do you get them down the long, thin island if your transport fleet is basically paralyzed because of this oil embargo?
Yeah, it's also just a drop in the ocean of what Cuba probably needs. How long do you think the island can go on in this situation?
Well, I mean, your previous report talked about the impact of the problems with the global oil supply within 2 or 3 weeks on countries, and Cuba has now not had any oil entering the country for 3 months. So the situation is already dire. You have hospitals that have closed to all but emergency treatment. You have over 11,000 children whose surgeries have been postponed. Schools, universities have shut and sent students home. Workplaces are running at a minimum. So, but at the same time, the Cubans have lived with this blockade and they have lived with economic crisis. And what we're seeing is the usual pattern of people turning to their neighbors and within their communities and trying to find collective community solutions to these problems. But we have to be realistic. How long can any nation survive without oil? In this scenario that I've depicted, where food cannot be harvested because the tractors have no fuel, where operations aren't taking place. It's very hard to say, and I think really the answer depends on the response of the international community. The solidarity activists who've arrived for the global convoy, as you say, it's a drop in the ocean, but their presence, their mobilization is a reflection of frustration with the international community. Cuba is a member of the United Nations. It has, the cooperation agreement with the EU. And what are those entities doing to prevent Trump from weaponizing starvation through this oil blockade? I mean, it's extremely cruel. And whatever you think about the Cuban system, and even whatever the Cubans think about their system, and a policy like this, which is an attack on people's right to survive, really should not be tolerated. Who knows how long Cuba can survive if it's isolated? what we should be doing is demanding that international bodies take action.
And why haven't we seen more action, do you think?
Well, I mean, we saw the violent abduction of President Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela, and I think that was a strong message that Trump is not concerned, or his administration is not concerned about international law. They violated so many international laws and piracy laws by previously hijacking Venezuelan oil tankers. And it's been very clear that they're threatening Cuba's allies and friends, such as the president of Mexico, who has continued to send humanitarian aid but stopped sending oil to Cuba. So I think that really this is just a reflection of the global political situation in which you have the US government more or less out of control, and countries are not prepared to risk any kind of military conflict or even the economic warfare, which Trump has shown he's very prepared to use with the leverage that they have over the international financial system and the imposition of sanctions.
The Cuban government has confirmed that they are in talks with the US. Do you think there's any chance at all that this could end with some sort of deal?
The Cubans have always talked to the United States, and those talks began almost as soon as the rupture. So a few months after the two countries broke off diplomatic relations in 1961, it was actually Che Guevara who first reached out to his counterpart at a regional meeting and said, we should talk. So it's not such a big deal that the Cubans are talking to the US government, even under the most hostile Bush, Reagan administrations and so on, previous Trump administration, there were talks. But the point is the Cubans are being very clear that they are not negotiating. They are not prepared to sort of cross certain lines, right? They will not allow interference in their domestic political affairs. What they will do is they've said they're talking to identify the differences and problems in order then, as a first step towards, in order then moving on to discuss how they can, find some way around those. But this is not the Cubans have been very clear. You showed a clip there of Miguel Diaz-Canel, the president, saying, we are not going to accept a return to Cuba's previous status as a sort of a pseudo republic under the control of the United States. And the Cubans have made that very clear. They're not going to accept a return to US domination of the island. And they are prepared to fight to defend their sovereignty and their right to self-determination.
There are reportedly 2 Russian oil tankers headed to Cuba. Do you think that Russia might be willing to sort of step in and confront the United States over Cuba in a way that other countries are not doing?
You'd hope so. I mean, the Russians already face sanctions, right? So, the threat of imposing tariffs it doesn't have the same weight. But I believe one of those tankers has already veered off, and the other, it's not certain what will happen. This has happened before. Several weeks ago, there was a Russian tanker, and everybody thought this would alleviate the situation, and then it veered off. So, I mean, the only way that I can see if countries are really concerned about what would happen to their tankers is they would need a collective response, so that several countries or multiple countries would send oil tankers at the same time. I mean, it's very interesting. If you look around the world, Cuba has given support to so many governments and so many countries, among them oil producing nations. And you just wonder why they haven't stepped up in Cuba's moment of need.
All right, Helen Yaffe, thank you again so much for bringing us your analysis this morning. That's Helen Yaffe, a professor of Latin American political economy at the University of Glasgow.